Alrighty, Dan, why don't you go ahead and get started there?
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan, and I'm part of the events team at University Bookstore in Seattle, Washington, and I'd like to welcome you to our event. University Bookstore is the oldest independent bookstore in the region. In fact, we are celebrating our 121st anniversary this year. We are currently open to the public 12 to 4 every day, and also offer curbside pickup. Please check out our website, ubookstore.com, and that's the letter U, bookstore.com, for the latest information about our hours. There are plans for us to be expanding our hours in the future, so check out our website for news of when that will happen. Tonight, University Bookstore and Microsoft Alumni Network are proud to present the second event in our new speaker series featuring leadership and business titles written by former Microsoft staff and published by HarperCollins Leadership. Our author is Paul Shoemaker, here to talk about his new book, Taking Charge of Change. New book, Taking Charge of Change, How Rebuilders Solve Hard Problems. Paul will be in conversation with Tod Bergstrom, Assistant Teaching Professor of Business Law at the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington. The Microsoft Alumni Network is a worldwide community of alumni who share a common experience of having worked at Microsoft. Founded in 1995 by a few alumni who wanted to stay connected, the Alumni Network today is a member organization representing more than 48,000 alumni in 54 countries. Paul Shoemaker is the founding president of Social Venture Partners International, the world's largest philanthropic network of its kind, with offices in 40 cities and 8 countries that connects social innovators, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, and business and community leaders with insights from over 17 years of this unique vantage point, as well as a decade prior at Microsoft and Nestle. He is today a global thought leader and consultant on activating social change agents and increasing impact. This is his second book. His first is Can't Not Do, the compelling social drive that changes the world. Paul recently launched a podcast, Rebuilders, Leaders We Need for the Decade Ahead. Paul is in conversation with Tod Bergstrom of the UW's Foster School of Business, where he is an assistant teaching professor of business law and part-time lecturer of management and organization. When he's not teaching, he's the senior deputy prosecuting attorney, King County Prosecutor's Office. Just a few more things before we get started. We will post the link of the book through the chat periodically, and this event is being recorded and will be on University Bookstore's YouTube channel in 2 to 3 days. So let folks know who may have missed the lecture right now. If you have any questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A field and they will be answered as the event progresses. And now I'm going to turn things over to Tod.
Thank you. Our guest tonight is Paul Shoemaker. His new book, Taking Charge of Change, identifies key traits or strengths that highly effective people have as they work toward a more just society. In the book, Paul introduces the reader to more than 30 people who he refers to as rebuilders. Paul, how did you get the idea for the book, Taking Charge of Change, and why do you feel so strongly about it?
You bet. So thanks for having me, Tod, and thanks to UW, and thanks to the Microsoft Alumni Network. Let me take sort of about 5 or 6 minutes and give a longer answer to your first question. It'll set the context for a lot of it. So to anyone listening, share a visual with me here for just a minute. For the second half of the 20th century, America was slowly, unevenly, but surely climbing a mountain. For the last 20 years, we have been on a descending path back down that mountain. And 2020 was like being on a path on that mountain and falling down the hillside abruptly. That mountain and its apex is economic, social, and health equity in America. Making progress again and making our way back up that mountain, overcoming the obstacles and the divisions and the detours, to me is one of the, if not the greatest leadership challenge of the decade ahead. Leaders haven't faced a decade this complex and inequitable in nearly 100 years. And I believe there are 5 vital leadership traits that will make the difference in the decade we are starting into. So for me, this project, Todd, it started as sort of a wake-up call in 2018. I was working on a project related to poverty in America. There wasn't a book anywhere in my head. I've done lots of social impact space work over the last 20 years, and I've definitely know about health disparities. I know about economic disparities. I know about racial inequities. But what I've been doing is sort of like looking at those at individual snapshots at a moment in time, sort of like the tiny frames in a photo mosaic. You can see one at a time, but until you sort of like step back, you don't see the full picture. You don't see the full image. Well, that's what it was for me looking at inequities in America. When I finally did, it wasn't just the scale and the scope, it was also the pace and the downward path of inequities in America. Over these last 20 years, economic and wealth disparities, we know they've been widening. We all know that story. Educational achievement gaps, we've been making progress up until about 2005. Now they're going the wrong direction. We can talk about quantity of health, but in terms of quality of health and the access to it, that gap is widening. So that whole picture and that whole image, to me, says that economic, social, and health inequity is the context for leadership in America today. Okay, so for me, after 2018, and sort of having that wake-up call, I started to ask myself, what kinds of leaders were going to help us start climbing back up that mountain again? So again, I've had 20 years of experience, big organizations, small ones, pretty much any cause area, all 3 sectors. I was doing Venn diagrams. I was doing spreadsheets. I was writing stuff on the whiteboards. And I'm going to use 2 slides real quickly just to ground us and sort of where my thinking was and where that came from. So what I was looking for in 2019 in my research was, number one, the great leaders I'd worked with. Secondly, also where I saw evidence of true social impact. And number 3, what did I believe would be needed for the challenges of the decade ahead? The intersection of those 3, those are the 5 vital traits that I talk about. And they arise directly at the intersection of people and leaders that meet those 3 vectors where they come together. And those 5 traits, I'm going to summarize them here and we can dive into them more later if folks want to in a minute. One is generosity mindset. I'll give a 1-sentence definition on these, Todd. This is a strategic focus on the ultimate goal. These are people that move past all diversions. They get the best from everyone. They make the whole greater than the parts. 24/7 authenticity is a relentless, persistent commitment to honesty, integrity, and personal accountability. We know that's in short supply these days. Data conviction. These are people that have a core belief that data is indispensable. It's strategic, not tactical. They also know how to use data in the right ways, not in the wrong ways. Capacity for complexity, thinking in a non-linear, less sequential way to take in, make sense of, and act on new information constantly. By the way, on average, women are better than men at that. And the final one is this thing I call cross-sector fluency. These are leaders that have sort of an ease and a natural movement across all 3 sectors, private, public, nonprofit, in a really fluid, sort of non-transactional way. So if you can remember those 3 circles and those 5 traits, that's sort of the grounding for today. So by 2019, now I've got a point of view based on some research and a story to sort of follow up on that wake-up call and that more holistic view of our inequities that I developed in 2018. And then 2020 happened. There's a quote, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Comes from Vladimir Lenin. It's 100 years old, and it's also still very resonant today. So as we all know, there was more than 1 week when a decade happened in 2020. So that mountain I was talking about earlier, 2020 was that steep fall down a hillside on that path. Things like disparities in death rates for Black and brown people, 2 to 3 times the population. That educational gap, it's only wide, we just don't know by how much. Women's careers were stalled or delayed, sometimes by a decade. And the other thing I would add on top of it isn't just inequity, it's also complexity. We have this divided, siloed America. We have a technology divide in hypermedia that loves to amplify those divisions and deepen those silos. We have all 3 sectors blurring together like they never have before. Opportunity, yes. Complexity, hell yes. And we just have a range of challenges that are just historic. Climate, geopolitical, I could go on and on. So it's just the scale and scope of them. Every one of the 5 traits that came up, they respond to one of those complexities. But the summary point here is that the world's leaders don't just face inequities, they also face complexity. So the journey of this book goes from wake up call, learn something new, thought of something in 2018, 2019, have a point of view. Should I write something? 2020, I feel the passion, a need to write the book. As has always been the case and always will be the case, these times call for a new kind of leader. My description is civically active, socially conscious leaders in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors that are ready to define the leaders they need to be in the decade ahead in a siloed, uneven America. And a last thought, just to be clear, this is not a leadership book about strategy or teams or culture. I'm writing a book about the kinds of leaders that we need to have to reverse those inequities in America and that will enable us to begin climbing that mountain back to greater economic, social, and health equity. Those are the kind of leaders I'm talking about. Those are the kinds of traits I identified. So that's a 7-minute sort of like long-winded answer. I won't make any of the rest of them that long, but I hope it sets some groundwork and a foundation for our conversation.
Paul, one of the things I found most enjoyable about your book is the breadth of individuals that you were able to introduce the reader to. In the scope of the book, we met people from all around the country, both in the public sector and the private sector, doing lots of different things. And as someone who spent most of my life in the Seattle area, it's really quite fascinating how broad of a net you have cast that have enabled you to capture so many different people. And I suspect that listeners would gain something from hearing a bit about your personal history that have allowed you to have access and to get to know some of these people, because as I read the book, it's quite clear to me that some of these people you've known for more than a decade. And I think that the history of what you've done and how you got to know and follow these people, I think is fascinating.
Thanks. So the first comment I'll make is probably like a lot of our careers, I would love to look back now and say it was all intentional. And that's the way I planned it. It was highly organic. So business school degree in Texas. Next 13 years, private sector work. Nestle, a startup that failed, Microsoft. I think everybody should spend time in the private sector, no matter what sort of degree of social purpose you have. There's just an incredible amount of knowledge you take away from that experience. Next 17 years, we're helping to build Social Venture Partners, which is this global network of engaged philanthropists and citizens. I wasn't the founder of it. I was the guy hanging around at the start to run it. So I was the director in Seattle, and then we grew it into a network of 40 cities in 8 countries. And I will say, Todd, during that experience, we changed my title from executive director to executive connector at some point. And it was sort of inherent to the job. Somewhere in there also just what clicked for me, which is not at all rocket science, is it's your network. And I will say that was sort of early internet days. And so there was a lot more sort of manual intentionality to it. I just met so many people, and I was very intentional about building that database of people. And one of my beliefs was that sometimes introductions, sometimes connections, you don't know where they're going. You don't know if you're gonna get value out of it or not, but you just make the connection. So the reason I know a lot of those folks is because over that 17 years, I just built a hell of a network. The last 6 years, I've been a private consultant, working with some of those folks I met in those 17 years, but I've worked in the social impact space with for-profits, nonprofits, and public sector organizations. And so in the whole, after 30 plus years, I've got this range of people, these range of experiences, and these range of causes that I've worked on that give me sort of that breadth of a network.
And you describe so many of the people that you have profiled in the book as rebuilders as opposed to builders. And I'm wondering whether you can talk a little bit more about how you see the distinction between a rebuilder and a builder.
So I'll describe two things. I'll describe sort of what it means and a little bit about where it came from. So the first part of it is when I look at where we are in 2021, and of course I was writing this in 2020, don't misunderstand, innovation will always matter. Innovation is always critical. It's part of what makes America what it is. We're also a country that is somewhat resource constrained. We're not necessarily able to say we've got everything that we need. When it comes to things like climate, the idea is actually to reduce, right, our consumption. So I thought both in terms of using more of what we have, and then the idea of we have been through a hell of a 10 years here, especially in 2020, and the fact that we need to rebuild was just a good analogy. Where that came from, which I think is your follow-up question, is when I went through all those traits and attributes, and when I was sort of thinking of what do I call these people, some of those things I just said to you were in my head. And then literally the bridge metaphor comes because when I was little growing up, I lived in Fort Dodge, Iowa, and there was this small little bridge in Snell Crawford Park, which was behind my house, in the woods behind my house. And I would go sit underneath that bridge for hours in the summer and just like listen to stuff go over it. So I'm not an engineer, but I was fascinated by bridges. I still am. And so I just sort of took the idea of bridges, which are in a state of disrepair. As we know, 8% of buildings in America are in need of urgent rebuilding. So, and every bridge is built on a foundation. So our civil society is built on a solid foundation. Our bridges need to be built on a civil foundation, on a strong foundation. And we are going to need rebuilders to rebuild our bridges, and we're going to need rebuilders to rebuild our civil society.
So you list in the book 5 essential challenges, and I know you've referred to them broadly up to this point, but I'd like to hear a little bit more, if I could, about some of these. And you begin by discussing unequal access to technology. Tell us a little bit more about a direction that we need to reorient ourselves in that area.
Right. So quick context, when I sort of define 5 mega challenges, it's a little bit like a pie. You could slice the world's challenges right in the decade ahead. You can sort of slice into 3 slices or 5 slices or 10 slices. I just sort of sliced it into these 5 sort of parts. So folks might think it's something different, and I'm okay with that. So a technology divide, technology is this amazing thing. I was hanging out at Microsoft in the 90s, and it was this amazing, right, sense of possibility, and everything about it was good. I'm describing history that most folks on this call know. The internet comes along, even more possibility, even more, right, greatness to it. Somewhere in the last 5 to 10 years here, if you look at what you need to use and take advantage of and be productive with and get ahead with in society when it comes to technology, it's a little bit like kids sports, and 20 years ago, we all sort of had a bat and a ball, we go to the diamond. Well, now some kids have coaches and leagues they play in and fancy equipment and fancy bats and balls. Same thing when it comes to technology. So rural areas of America, right, which don't, in some cases, even have access to broadband, much less the right technology, they are way behind. When technology sort of got rolling, got going in the late 90s and early 2000s, we were all sort of in an embryonic early stage. It was kind of evenly cut. And now over time, it's widened. So there's all these kinds of sort of dark sides as well as good sides to technology, but that stretching of the gap in technology, who can use it, for what purposes, how much does it cost, how can you access it? That is a source of real divide in America. And God knows we have a lot of divides in America with or without technology.
You also describe America as being less connected and more siloed. And it seems that that particular concern is one that's shared by a lot of people. What's your conception of that?
Wow. I am not the first person to talk about this one, of course. It's just so in your face all the time. And I guess I'll say this, every one of those traits responds to one of those challenges. Not exactly, not perfectly, but I was trying to put a little bit of logic into it, right? So the trait that I said aligns with and responds to this division and silos is what I call 24/7 authenticity. So the fact that we're divided and siloed, to some degree, that's a fact. To some degree, it's going to stay there. The question is, how much is it going to stay there? How prevalent is it going to be? Can we make progress in the other direction? And I think the leadership trait that is just absolutely mandatory is people that are relentlessly, persistently hold themselves to the highest personal accountability and the highest ethical standards. And honesty is their middle name, right? And it's sort of like honesty and integrity on steroids. We see so many examples these days of people that don't have that. And all that does is sort of like feed the noise that we've got. So I guess I have this sort of slight leap of faith that says, in spite of those divisions and silos, we cannot give up on believing that we can get ourselves back to a set of facts that we agree on, and just, we can disagree on the facts as long as we have a set of facts we sort of share in common. I don't think we're going to get back to where we were 50 years ago, but I think we have to get back to a place, a better place than where we are right now. Last comment, to me, it's also a great example of something in 2020, it accelerated it. One of the things you realize now is that being in contact, human contact in person with other people, one of the things it does is it makes us each behave. Right? We got to show up and we got to sort of act a certain way. So that's part of how society functions, is because we interact with other people and we have to tamp down some of our worst impulses. So I would say the divisions and silos, everybody knows these. It's one of those things that in 2020, it was already a problem and it just got accelerated and accentuated because of everything that happened with COVID.
So what I hear you saying is something that I think a lot of people have been talking about, which is that COVID unfortunately revealed more significant challenges with people being siloed. And, does that portend, a worse future for us, you think?
I'd say it's an open question. I think, it's like every 4 years when we have a presidential election, the candidates will always say, we're at an inflection point. This time I'd say we truly are. So I'd say the answer to your question is to be determined. I would say I am sort of realistically optimistic. And I believe that enough people will wake up to this and understand this. We're gaining a much deeper understanding of it now. I read this article a month ago about the guy that's the head of AI at Facebook. And it's very sobering because he said, we spent months and months and months studying how can we run this business on a more sort of like positive, set of signals, et cetera. And so the problem is every time we tried, business went down. And what drives business up is dissension and disagreement and vitriol. So we got that what we're working against. But what I would say is versus even 3 or 4 years ago, I think we have a much better understanding of it. Now we have to decide what the hell we're going to do with it. Seth Godin is a brilliant entrepreneur, written about 20 books. Some folks probably get his blogs. About a month ago, he wrote this blog post that said, until we can make the incentive for profit better line up with positive in the world, we're going to continue to have this dissonance and this conflict. I don't know how to resolve it. What I do think is we have a better understanding, and I have some faith that enough leaders will figure out how to guide us through that.
So when we began talking, you indicated that you'd had these 5 traits that you found were common in the leaders that you profiled. And as I read the book, one of the things that was very enjoyable as a Seattleite was the people that you talked about who I recognized as having been in our community And it's certainly the case that I think people living in other parts of the United States are going to enjoy your book a great deal, but there's a special enjoyment when you recognize and know people that you have talked about, and you know them by reputation in the community. And so I'd like to talk for a minute, or for a couple of minutes, about 5 of the people that you profiled in the book that really are great examples of the traits that you're looking for. Let's begin with authenticity and your 24/7 authenticity. And you singled out the former Seattle Seahawk Doug Baldwin as someone who is a great example of that. And I'm wondering whether you can just use Doug Baldwin to sort of talk about 24/7 authenticity and why it's so important.
So, couple quick points of context. The core ideas in this book came from, a lot experiences over lots of years, and then talking to 2 or 3 dozen of these folks that I knew really well. That was the sort of 2019 conversations to sort of develop and test a hypothesis or a bunch of hypotheses. So some of those folks in the book I have known, as you said, 10, 20 years. Doug's a guy that's sort of like in that next circle. Like I've met him in the last 5 years or so. So when I was trying to sort of build out the book, I didn't want to just have folks I knew. I wanted to sort of broaden the audience. And I also wanted it to be from, different walks of life. So we all can't, catch passes across the middle of the field like Doug Baldwin can, but I always experienced him as a deeply authentic person. When he was early in his career, he was sometimes sort of authentically immature, I think he would say. But you always knew it was coming out of that guy's mouth. He meant it. He always was very intentional about the words that he used. There's just nothing about that guy that says fake or I can't trust you. And he said to me more than once that we talked, I've gotten to him a little bit as a friend. We don't go, throwing the football around together. But he said, I don't care if people don't like me as long as they understand me and they're clear about what I believe and I feel about something. So he's a great example of someone from maybe sort of a less expected walk of life, if you will. But I think he really, really exemplifies it. And by the way, I'm doing a evening with him at Town Hall on May 18th. So quick little message there. May 18th, Town Hall, Seattle with Doug Baldwin. So he's just a great example of somebody. I think he absolutely lives his life with authenticity in just sort of like everything he does and the way he is, was on the football field, the way he was off the football field, and the way he's looking at the rest of his life now.
You also profile Howard Behar, who most people will know as Schultz's partner in the founding of Starbucks. And you talk about Howard as someone who is an example of the generosity mindset. Tell the viewers why you think that's the case.
Right. So I think a lot of folks know who Howard Behar is. Generosity mindset. The person that word came from was a woman named Roseanne Haggerty. This was about 2 years ago. She was one of those core people I was talking to. She was walking down the street in New York City when folks still did that. Her organization works on ending homelessness. And they, in fact, know how to do this because they've done it many times in communities. We need people like that in Seattle, but that's a whole other conversation. When I was asking her, how do you land in cities and start to develop a community solution around homelessness? What's the key strategy? She said, I have to take a generosity mindset. Like it just fell out of her mouth. And it sort of struck me as like an odd, really like, doesn't have to be, going to be tough and, et cetera, et cetera. And her point was the only chance I have to be the kind of leader I need to solve this kind of a complex problem is I have to be the person that's in the room that is always looking to get the best out of everyone, that is getting past their ego to the end goal, that doesn't let diversions and detours take me off track. And a lot of that sounds sort of like nicey nice, if you will, but people that practice this, it's a hard edged strategy that comes from a really mentally tough person. So I don't want generosity mindset to sort of get like tamped down and sort of softened. It's actually a very direct, very specific strategy. There's one more person. I think she's episode 8 of my podcast. Her name is Cecilia Gutierrez. She could teach a master class in generosity mindset. So Howard is, I would be willing to bet if you sort of polled people in the business community in Seattle today and say, who's your mentor? I'll bet you more people would say Howard PR than just about anyone else. He is such a generous human being. He obviously knows how to build and run a profitable business, but he always said, I cannot build my business on the backs of people. Our people have to build it with our people. He is an absolute disciple of servant leadership. So he's an example of a guy that's pretty fully formed and has been thinking and living this stuff his whole life. And I just thought he exemplified that generosity mindset that I first heard from Roseanne Haggerty.
The traits that we're talking about and the people that illustrate these traits, I'm wondering how much thought you've given to whether or not these qualities are innate for the most part, or whether or not they're learned, and that people, as they go through developmental stages, it occurs to them that I can make a better contribution if I cast myself in a little bit of a different mold. So innate qualities, learned qualities, my guess is some combination of both.
Yep. So I spend a little bit of the time in the book on that. I didn't want to make it sort of like too big of a theme, but it's a very relevant question. And any leadership trait is learnable, right? We all have to believe that. So this is more sort of a statement of like degrees of relative learnability, if you will. So what I would say is my experience says the trait of complexity capacity is the hardest one to learn. I think you kind of have an innate sense of being able to deal with complexity or not. You have somewhat of an innate sense to be able to process multiple variables at one time and constantly keep processing them and feeding those back out into and bringing in new information constantly, because that's the world that we live in. And by the way, I have a subsection of that chapter that's called "You Better Have Women in the Room." I didn't say that to pander to my wife. There's just no doubt about it. Women are better at complexity than guys are on average. They're just better at it. The other end of the spectrum, I would say, is cross-sector fluency. You can decide intentionally, I want to walk through all three sectors. And I don't mean just in sort of like an occasional episodic, but over the course of a 20, 30, 40-year career, you can expose yourself to pretty deep experiences in all three sectors. So you can decide pretty intentionally to do that. The other three, kind of a mix in the middle, 24/7 authenticity, generosity, mindset, data conviction. They're all to some degrees learnable. And I would say the people I've got in the book, I hope some of them are younger folks, some of them are older folks. I try to have a mix of people, and that also the experiences that they each came from were different. And part of the reason to do that was I want to make sure when folks read this book that they feel like there's at least a handful of people in that book whose life story and life experiences they can identify with, so they can see themselves in that leadership trait. So great question. That's kind of the way I see it. That's one of those very relative, subjective kinds of questions. I would never want anybody to think that any leadership trait is not learnable, because it is. Some are harder than others.
You mentioned complexity capacity as being sort of the most difficult trait to train people, the trait that is probably the most innate in terms of the 5 different traits that you mentioned. And I think that that's a good transition point to the person that you profiled in the book as being a master class at complexity capacity. And I was delighted to see that the person you profiled was Chris Gregoire, Washington State's former governor, on that point. Several years ago, Governor Gregoire was a guest speaker in my class, and I asked her, rather than talk about her experience as governor, I wanted her to, talk about her experience as state attorney general suing the tobacco companies. Yeah. And it was really interesting because she told the class she spent hours having to go back and reacquaint herself with the litigation strategy, which was highly complex. And more recently, readers or viewers may not know that Chris Gregoire has taken a substantial lead among local businesses in Western Washington in trying to get ready to move out of COVID. And so tell us more about Chris Gregoire. It doesn't surprise me at all that you chose her, but I think that you did such a wonderful job of explaining why she is the best example of someone who is just a masterclass at complexity capacity.
I love telling her story. And by the way, to folks listening, I realize the last three people we just talked about are pretty well known. There is a mix of people in this book. Some of these people you'll never heard of them before. Other ones like Doug, Howard, Chris Gregoire, you will have heard of before. So it's a mix of folks. I even forgot about the tobacco example. That should have been in the book. I need to put her on my podcast in a few months so I can sort of update that part of the book. The example I give in the book and the story I tell her mastery of complexity through is COVID. And it's actually, it's relatively dramatic. I don't want to use that word too flippantly given what COVID's been and is, but I think everybody here probably remembers on about March 3rd or 4th, Microsoft shut down. That was a week before the NBA shut down, which I think is sometimes that's the first time people are like, oh crap, there's something real going on here when the NBA's stopping. And then a week or two after that, our government did some stuff and New York did stuff a week or two later. But the way it happened was she went and got data from Fred Hutch in January from a researcher there. His name's Trevor Mundell, who had about 5 Twitter followers. And now he has about 1 million Twitter followers. And she was seeing this data that just scared the crap out of her. And there's a group called Challenge Seattle that she's a part of, which is all sort of like the leading CEOs in the region. And so first of all, is this complexity factor with her is just taking in massive inputs on this, right? The amount of information coming at us in COVID at the start was so complex. It was so crazy. And then she's a great kind of person to try to digest that and simplify it. Another thing that she was able, at some point in time, she had to say, I've got some data and some information here that I've never seen before. If I put it on the table, it's going to scare the hell out of some people. This could really backfire on me. And at some point, she said, no, I got to put this on the table. She and her board chair, Susan Mullaney at Kaiser, sort of agreed, we got to bring everybody together and look at this. So that was late February. Well, that set of data was what led Microsoft to shut down and then Amazon. And as you well know, Washington's per capita case and death rate is better than just about anybody's in the country, except for the remote Northeast. And the next 3 or 4 months, when all these businesses were trying to decide what to do, again, she worked about 12 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, and the amount of inputs coming in again were just insane. And her job was to translate them back out to people. And what I would say is, I think it took a lot of people, and Chris is the first one to tell you that. But having someone different in that fulcrum position she was in, I think we could have had a very different outcome. And you can calculate it in human lives, right? But she was just the kind of person that could take this massive amount of inputs, sort of think about it, do something with it, just like she did with the tobacco settlement, and then process it back out and make it make sense so that people can make good decisions with it, right? That example is a little bit of a dramatic one. It's obviously a very relevant one. It's just a really powerful story of what having the right kind of leader with the right kind of trait at the right moment in time, the difference they can make.
I agree. I think in the work that she continues to do, as profiled in the Seattle Times recently, trying to work with businesses, I think she's a terrific resource, and her willingness to continue to be as deeply engaged as she is in the community is certainly commendable. You describe Jeff Edmondson, and you talk about him in the book as someone who has mastered data conviction. And I think he is also someone that I think is worth talking about for a few minutes.
Okay. So Jeff is one of those guys I met 20 years ago in sort of the whole SVP journey. He started an educational network across the country called Strive Together, which still exists and has some powerful data about how to try to make schools perform better for their students. Jeff now works at the Ballmer Group. The reason he's in data conviction was he is, number one, he is a very data-driven person. He's one of these people that believes, particularly in the world we live in now, how complex and murky it is. Without data, you don't have a chance to sort of like cut through the mud. His example with the Strive Together program in Cincinnati, when he started it 10, 12 years ago, was we brought the whole community together. We said we have a big problem called education, which lots of communities could agree on. We have too many kids that are falling behind. What do we do about it? And he said, everybody shows up. The problem was for the first couple, 2 or 3 meetings, everybody's talking about programs and ideas, and like getting alignment was incredibly hard. And then finally, one person said, why don't we align on the data? And the data is just more objective. And they were able to get alignment on the data. So he's a great example of someone that, number one, used data, not in a tactical way, not in a numeric way. It was a highly strategic tool to get alignment amongst a lot of leaders. Having a conversation with him about data too is also fascinating, because he really also gets data. We know this, it's like statistics class, right? You can make numbers say anything. Data can be dangerous, right? If you take some data points and you look at them in aggregate, or you don't disaggregate them, or you look at them sort of in a cursory, lazy way, they can paint exactly the wrong picture. So another part of this data conviction is not only do you have sort of like the ability and the mindset to take it in and use it, you also know how to use it wisely, use it intentionally, use it carefully. And data is amazingly powerful. Another example in the book is this guy that runs waste management for the city of Phoenix. He is fascinating. That guy knows more about waste in the city of Phoenix. And knowing stuff about the waste in the city, you'd be amazed at how much that tells you about what goes on in the city and how to fix the city's problems. And he just has this deep data conviction about it. And Jeff is the first guy that I talk about in that chapter, just because he has a great story about how he used it. And he also has a real sophistication how he thinks about data, not just as a tactic or a number, but as a part of his strategy.
When we talk about data, I go back to your prior comments about COVID and how lucky we were to have Chris Gregoire with us with COVID, as well as all the other leaders in Western Washington that have sort of shepherded us through this. But at the same time, it's in the back of my mind, it continues to be so distressing that so many people have elected not to follow the data as it comes to COVID. And I just find that I find that to be a distressing part of, the whole COVID experience.
Couldn't agree more.
Heather Redmond, tell me about cross-sector fluency and Heather.
So Heather Redmond, some folks here know her. She's a venture capitalist in town. She was a co-founder of a VC firm called Flying Fish. So the way she thinks about cross-sector fluency is and not in a sort of Machiavellian way, she believes that what she learns in one sector gives her a stronger platform in another sector. So she's in the venture capital world. She also knows the public sector is going to affect her ability to, land and generate and fund entrepreneurs. She knows there's that connection. She cares about the economic development of the region. So she wants to know what's the Chamber of Commerce up to. So she's on the board of the Chamber of Commerce and deeply involved in it. The point is, the way that she operates is, I'll call it, she plays chess and the rest of us are playing checkers, right? Because she understands all three sectors, not in silos, not as individual parts, but these interconnected things, which is what they are. And she also sees the interconnections, sort of builds her career around that philosophy. And ultimately what it means is she's now got a deeper knowledge base, sort of a richer understanding of the context. The other two sectors are always context for that third one. So if you only live in one or two of them, you've got a piece of the context missing. So she's got this full holistic picture of all three sectors, which means a full holistic sort of view of the Puget Sound region. And I think she cares every bit about as much about government as she does about her private sector business, as she does about her nonprofit work. She's deeply embedded in and cares about all three of those. And we just need so many more leaders like that are fluent. Another great example, that's Brad Smith at Microsoft. And I've noticed that sometimes when you watch him at a press conference or you see something he puts out, the guy's talking about and answering a question, he will bounce around all three sectors in the same answer. And he does it just fluently, very naturally. He doesn't even know he's doing it. We need more leaders like those folks that can just know how to be fluent. That's the reason the word's fluent on the end is not because I want you to be cross-sector just to do it. We need people fluent in working that way and talking that way and thinking that way, those kinds of people are critical in a complex society like we have today.
So do you have a prescription for how University of Washington should approach this? You know, I teach in a business school. Some of the other guests on the call tonight also teach in a business school. And it strikes me that a lot of what you've written about in this book has a portable quality to it. And it would be wise, I think, to get young people to start thinking about these traits and these challenges, and to, you know, think critically about the value of working in different sectors so that they're able to make more lasting contributions. Have you given thought to how you'd you know, move this book into a teaching curriculum?
Baby steps. One baby step is I did create a discussion guide, which was done today, by the way, and I will make sure it gets PDF'd and sent out to everybody that's been on all these calls I've done over the last couple of weeks. That's a step. I've had a couple of conversations with a couple of learning and development companies to sort of look at what are the competencies that they develop in leaders, and are there ways to sort of, you know, parallel line up these traits against that? Can it inform that? I did a talk yesterday in San Francisco with San Francisco, and there's a school there called the Presidio Graduate School of Management, which is kind of like the Evans School on steroids. And they said, hey, can we talk about how to put that in our curriculum? So I'll be a little bit careful with, hey, should the UW listen to me about their curriculum? They got a lot of folks around there know how to develop curriculum. What I will say is my point of view is subjective. It's prospective. I also feel very passionate about it. It's a very informed, intentional set of characteristics that I think are absolutely critical. So I say the degree to which our business schools, I don't know, think about data and they think about cross-sector fluency, but they don't talk or think as much about a generosity mindset. I think we need leaders in all three sectors, including the private sector, that have a generous mindset. Look at what just happened in 2020, right? The leaders that were most effective, I will contend, are the ones that have the strongest generosity mindset. And somewhere in there, we convinced two major drug companies, right, to sort of start co-producing vaccines together. And you can say they had to. Yeah, they had to. But somewhere in those leaders, they had to have some degree of a generosity mindset to say, I'm willing to either give up profit or share my intellectual property with someone else for a greater cause. So I do think these traits, some of these are probably show up. I think other ones, I think they are really critical. They are maybe a little more right-brained than left-brained. And I love to have a conversation with the Foster School or anyone to talk about how we put those traits more into a curriculum. I'm sort of taking my baby steps down that pathway, but I believe fervently, deeply about those traits and about those kinds of leaders that we're going to need them in the decade ahead, or else we're in trouble.
Paul, I want to make sure we have an opportunity for people who are listening in to ask questions. And I know that we've got Dan and Ed who are moderating this. The Q&A box is open. And I'm not sure whether that's the preferred method. I think that the plan was for me to moderate questions. So if people who are listening in have questions for Paul, this would be a great time to throw something up in the Q&A box. Paul, as people are thinking about questions, there's lots of opportunities at Foster. I for one bring a bunch of guest speakers in, and I will be looking to invite you into an upper division ethics class next year, and probably try to reach out to a couple of the local people that are in the Seattle area to tell the story of your book with people actually coming in either personally or through Zoom, because I think that the stories you tell in particular, and I know we focused on well-known Western Washington people for the most part, the people that I selected, that really is just a feature of you being here and I think listeners being interested. But you note earlier that, you know, you choose people from all over the United States, and that I think is what's so compelling about this. And most of the people are not nearly as famous as the three people that we led off by discussing and talking about. as I look back at my notes, I guess the last question I had was based upon the book where you talked about traits that often go together, traits where you often see combinations of traits in highly successful people. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So either they show up or they should show up. A little bit of context. There are not many people that I would say possess all 5 of those traits. Chris Gregoire is probably about as close as it gets. So in one sense, it's not just an individual sort of muscle building checklist. It's also looking at our team and saying what would make our team stronger. Looking at our organization, say, how do we make our organization more resilient? So that's just sort of like, one piece of context to it. But what was the question you asked?
Traits that often go together.
Thank you. Sorry. The dyads, excuse me. I get off on a subject and I forget the original question. So there are particular pairs of those things that I saw show up a lot in the same person. Or you should think about them in your team together. So for example, generosity mindset and complexity capacity. I think those 2 things go together because the complexity one is about processing information. It's about taking it in. It's about being able to churn through it, process it constantly, understand that past solutions are not going to inform future ones. What you need along with that sort of, left brain intensity is this right brain capacity for generosity. How do I not only take that complexity in, but how do I use it effectively in real human lives with real people? 24/7 authenticity, data, conviction goes the other direction. For somebody that believes and wants to be somebody that's truly authentic in this world, you better have some data to back up your authenticity. So I just saw many times in leaders, not universally, but it happened enough times that I just thought it was an interesting sort of sidebar in the book to look at how these traits come together and how they sort of like relate to each other. And cross-sector fluency is sort of in the middle of all of that, because that tends to be that glue person that has a bigger, broader view of stuff and can bring all the parts and the pieces and the people together. But those are the 2 sort of dyads that cross over: 24/7 authenticity, data, conviction, generosity mindset with complexity capacity.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
I don't see any questions in the question box. And I want to give you an opportunity, Paul, to talk about the ability for people to get copies of your book. I know the bookstore is going to have signed copies that are available, and I want to make sure there's a chance for you and the bookstore staff to explain how that will work.
If someone in the bookstore wants to explain it, go for it. I think it's been in the chat more than once. I'll make sure there's a bunch of signed copies there.
Yeah. So anyone who wants any copy of the book, they can order it from the bookstore. There are some links in the chat there to our shop, and we can also arrange to get book plates from Paul on that. Last call for any questions. Anyone have one? All right. Well, I think I want to thank you, Paul and Tod, for stopping by and sharing this discussion with us. And a huge thank you to our audience today. This event will soon be available on the University Bookstore YouTube channel, so let everyone know. And again, you can purchase copies of Taking Charge of Change through the University Bookstore website. Thank you for joining us, and please check our website, social media, or sign up for our emails to hear about other upcoming events in our series with the Microsoft Alumni Network. Our next event in the series will be Back to Business by Nancy McSherry Jensen and Sarah Dunewald on April 28th, and you can register for that one on our website. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Tod.
Thanks very much, Paul. Have a nice evening.
You too.